Hello, I'm Dr. Michael Mason with the Institute for Global Transformation. I'm excited to have the opportunity to interview Richard Barrett, author of The New Psychology of Human Wellbeing. Richard Barrett is founder and chairman of the Barrett Value Center. He is recognized around the world as a thought leader on values, culture, and leadership in business and society. Richard is a fellow of the World Business Academy, an honorary board member of the Spirit of Humanity Forum, and a former values coordinator at the World Bank. Richard Barrett has published 6 important books, and today we're going to discuss one of them, The New Psychology of Human Wellbeing. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to get right into it. I have a list of questions here, and I'm going to start out with one. I'm quoting from your book, Richard. You wrote, aligning our ego motivations with our soul motivations. And it seems that your book is quite a bit about ego and soul and oneness. And it says, becoming more integrated and less split allows us to express ourselves in a particularly efficient and intensely enjoyable way. So the question is, how can this be accomplished for people who were never properly loved by their parents while growing up, which I understand from your biography that you were definitely had that experience.
Which experience? That I was properly loved or I was not properly loved?
You were properly loved quite a bit, and that really makes a difference, I notice, in sure. The potential for a person to connect with their soul and the fourth dimension.
Well, so let's start by just giving a big overview. I wrote this book, A New Psychology of Human Wellbeing, to bring the soul back into psychology. Way back in Carl Jung's time, let's go back 70 or 80 years, the soul was alive and well in psychology, and it wasn't just Carl Jung. There was Roberto Assagioli, and even Maslow had an understanding of that. So the first point is I wanted to bring the soul back into psychology. And so in order to do that, I had to develop a model of reality, which included both the ego and the soul. And in the book, I defined the ego as the creation of the soul and the guardian of the soul, in the sense that the soul finds it very difficult to live in our three-dimensional material world because it's a world of separation, and it's used to living in a world of connectedness, and therefore it pulls back a little and sets up the ego to manage our daily affairs. In other words, to manage the survival, safety, and security of the body. And so during those, now to get to your question, during those early years of our lives, our mind-brain is not fully operational. For the first 3 months of in the womb, we only have soul consciousness until the reptilian mind-brain forms, and then from 3 months of gestation through to about the age of 2, that reptilian mind brain is still dominant, and it's all focused on survival. It's the body mind keeping us alive, keeping the body alive. And then the limbic mind brain kicks in and becomes dominant, and that is an emotional mind which is focused on keeping us safe, and that mind stays dominant until we're about 8 years old, when the neocortex becomes dominant. But it's not fully developed actually until we're about 24, and so that explains why teenagers do stupid things, because we don't basically have a fully functioning brain until we get to our mid-20s, and you know, and after that, wow, what happens is now, depending, as you pointed out, depending on our experiences during this intense learning period, from the moment the reptilian mind brain forms right through to about mid-20s, that's an intense learning period where each of these mind brains is growing and developing synaptic connections based on its experiences of life. And so if you have a bad experience of life, you develop what I call limiting beliefs, which then stay with you for the rest of your life and become fodder for psychotherapeutic assistance. And, you know, and that's why we go to shrinks, basically, to correct all that stuff.
Right. So somebody who grows up without loving parents, as an orphan, or is abused, what kind of hope is there for a person like that? Turns into a
A
sociopath,
lot of hope.
psychopath.
Okay, so let's take it stage by stage. If you have a really difficult time during that time when the reptilian mind brain is dominant up to about the age of 2, that can produce sociopathic behavior, and it can produce a manipulative behavior, and it's very embedded. And there are ways to deal with that, which involve regression to that period of time, and reliving actually that time in the womb and giving those experiences a new meaning, because at that time you couldn't give them any meaning because you didn't have the reasoning power, and so you automatically defaulted to fear. That's what we do. Whenever something happens, the first thought is our worst thought, is our fear thought. And of course, that at that point in time, the worst thought is, I'm going to die. And so that then conditions us for the rest of our lives and can create absolutely sociopathic behavior. And it's very difficult to correct that, but it can be done by reliving the experience and giving it a new meaning. Now, the next stage, sorry, go ahead.
I assume that would be done through a form of hypnotherapy regression.
Exactly. Arthur Janoff, in his book, The Primal Scream, describes this work in great detail. Then comes that next stage, 2 to 7 or 8. Again, if the abuse is serious, one of the things that can happen is you can develop dissociative identity, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. Mm-hmm. And what happens there, just as the soul created the ego to protect itself, so the ego creates an alter ego to protect itself, so it can go on functioning when after it's experienced this abuse. And every time something similar to that, it is reminded of that abuse, the alter ego will show up. So these are serious conditions. However, thank God for most of us, they're just neuroses. I mean, they're just simply neuroses. And
Brian Weiss, I'm sure you're familiar with the author, Many Lives, Many Masters. I didn't see in your book anything regarding karma and reincarnation. I'd love to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there was a reason for that, because I wanted to make this book a bridge between mainstream psychology as it's developed, which is cognitive, back to soul consciousness. And I didn't want to, in inverted commas, contaminate it with spiritual thinking, in a sense. I wanted to make it very logical, very reasoned, so that I could take people there. So I specifically left out past lives and I left out karma because I didn't want to bring that in to the situation. Now, there is a sense in which, whether you're dealing with karma or past lives, it's happening in the present. And it's a situation that you're having to deal with now. And so I believe that we can deal with those situations now, even if we have an understanding that it is something that occurred prior to that time. And in fact, a regression, a hypnotherapy can get to the source of those malfunctions in this lifetime, which come from past lifetime. In fact, I'm a trained hypnotherapist myself, although I don't do it these days, and I used to do past life regressions to help people do this work. But as I say, I didn't put it in the book for that very specific reason.
Okay, now, do you believe that the soul in any way chooses the potential life experiences, the parents, the geographical area that it will be born into?
Well, the big answer to that is I don't know. And so your question was correct. Do I believe?
Yes, exactly.
And So, you know, usually I get insights and then I write about things, and I research things, and then based on the research, if my intuition is backed up by research, I write about it. Now, um, I, I've got an open mind on that question, frankly, and whether I believe it or not, I think it's up to individuals to decide whether that is true. It doesn't negate anything that I've written. It's just another layer of understanding, which, if you believe it to be true, that's fine, and it doesn't go against anything I've written.
Thank you. Can you name 3 people who've had the greatest impact in your life, and how?
Well, I can. 3 is a bit limiting.
Okay, well, the 3 most important.
But I'll go with that.
Come to mind.
Yeah, I'll go with that. I think I have to say that Abraham Maslow has probably had the biggest impact, because I took his model over 20 years ago. I expanded it, and I took it from needs into consciousness. I redefined self-actualization in 3 layers by comparing Maslow's model with Vedic philosophy, and came up with the 7 levels of consciousness model, which then I realized that any level of consciousness is defined by particular values. So if you tell me your values, I can tell you which levels of consciousness you're operating from. And that became a tool which I developed 20 years ago, and is now used all over the world to measure the values of leaders and organizations. It's in 90 countries. We've trained 7,000 change agents and consultants and people, how shall I say it, coaches, to use these tools. And it's a very viable and prosperous business. And so I have to say that, I guess, that Maslow was a big influence. But having said that, boy, I could name many other books that have influenced my thinking, including, as I already mentioned, Carl Jung or Roberto Assagioli, Eastern mystics. Yeah, I've been reading this stuff all my life, and you know, it's been a joy to me to be on this particular journey and to bring all of these thoughts together.
You and I have a very parallel path. That was so wonderful reading your book and seeing how you put the concept of oneness, the concept of all is perception, which are axioms that I'm developing myself in practical quantum metaphysics. I'm going to get into another question here. A quote from your book: "We think of ourselves as material beings, whereas in reality we're energetic beings. Aren't we really both, since all material is just another form of energy based on E equals MC squared?"
Oh, well, you can take that point of view, saying that we are both, but one system lives inside another system. Okay, these are not parallel systems, and so in my book, I firmly come out saying that the material dimension lives inside the energetic dimension, and
the material and the physical is contained within the energetic. Exactly, that's another quote.
Yeah, so I would so if you take that point of view you're living in duality. You know, you're living in there's mind and material. Well, whereas if you take my point of view, you're in a non-dual world. You're living in an energetic world where everything is derived from energy, and of course, energy is the source. When you have an observer in this three-dimensional physical world, that energy crystallizes from potentiality into specific outcome, and crystallizes into protons, neutrons, electrons, atoms, molecules, cells, etc., and it's really hard to say. To get over the fact that this table I'm banging now feels solid, but actually it's 2 different energy energy fields coming into contact, and one energy field is denser than the other, and it creates the appearance of solid.
Yes.
And there are people who, who can get past that belief, and in psychic surgery, for example, is where you're able to get past the belief that that there is the material world and the energetic world. It all becomes energetic, and that means you can do psychic surgery.
Right. Now, I noticed that it took a while in reading your book before you even mentioned God and the divine.
Yeah.
And I assume that's similar to the reason why you didn't get into past lives and karma. You didn't want to get too deeply spiritual. What do you consider divine?
Well, so this is a very interesting question, because in the book I'm writing right now, this is a little aside, I believe we have to move beyond the spirituality. And spirituality is a worldview that's allowed people from different connect with each other because it's what's common. But the next step in the worldview is to realize that spirituality is one explanation of our reality, along with science and along with psychology. And so in order for us to unite these three, we need to move beyond spirituality into the energetic world, and that's the world of the soul, the world of non-duality. And so that's, for me, is how I position myself with regard to spirituality. I'm actually suggesting in this book that we move beyond that into something called soul consciousness. Now, remind me of your question again, because I didn't answer it.
Well, what do you consider divine?
Divine, thank you.
And a corollary to that would be, is there a divine plan? And if so, what might that be? Okay,
so again, we're now into the realm of belief. I'd like to, not fact. And I'm very careful to differentiate between that, my researches and my beliefs. For me, every person, and actually everything in our three-dimensional material world, is an individuated aspect of a universal energy field.
Beautiful.
And so that universal energy field, I could call it the one mind, which I do in the book, but I could also, if I wanted to, call it God. However, that we are all co-creators of the world that we live in. And so because we're all aspects of that one mind. So what I do today and what you do today affects the overall energetic situation on the planet, frankly. Go ahead.
Interpenetration, they call it. Anything that we do affects the whole level of spirituality of the whole world.
And so in this sense, I would agree. I would suggest, or I believe, that we are all aspects of that one mind. And if you want to call that one mind God, fine. Right. And is there a divine plan? I have no idea whether there's but when you look at the evidence suggests that there is. And what is that evidence? Well, the evidence is that if you go back in our three-dimensional materiality to the Big Bang to the present day, what you see is a constant evolution of consciousness. I call it the universal, I didn't talk about it in this book, or if I did briefly, the universal principles of evolution. So at any particular level, the atomic, the cellular, the molecular, the cellular, or the plane of creatures, the first stage is to become viable and independent in your framework of existence, so you can survive in this three-dimensional material world. Then as life becomes more difficult on us, in order to increase your resilience, and as life becomes even more complex, those group structures cooperate with each other to create a higher order entity. And so that's how we moved from atoms to molecules to cells to organisms to creatures, and one of those creatures, Homo sapiens, is on the same path. So is there a divine plan?
Higher levels of consciousness.
There is a divine, there is a sense of a direction. and that has been going on for billions of years and has been accelerating rapidly with the evolution of with the evolution of Homo sapiens.
Right. Now, quoting from your book, you said, when we live our lives in alignment with the motivations of the soul, we experience a deep sense of well-being and robust physical health because we are living in a state of psychological and energetic coherence.
Correct.
If we fail to live in psychological and energetic coherence, we experience emotional upsets, mental suffering, stress, and psychosomatic disorders. Can this alignment be taught to anyone?
Absolutely. Yeah, and in fact, having written this book, I actually decided, this was a big book for me to write, but I did it in about 15 months. I am now doing workshops around this, so like a 4-day workshop called From Wellbeing to Flourishing, which speaks to this very point. So, the first workshop actually is in 2 weeks' time in Italy, where I spend the summer, and I've got another one coming in up in September. So I decided to teach this because it is fundamentally important for every human being to understand we don't live in flatland, we live in stages of psychological development. Each stage has its particular tasks, and your sense of well-being depends on how well you can master the task at the stage that you are at. And as you approach the latter part of your life, if you manage to get through the first 3 stages, survival, safety, and security, and then you manage to individuate, become your own person, let go of your parental and cultural conditioning, and move forward into self-expression of the soul, connecting with others to make a difference, and contributing to the good of the whole. As you move into those last 2 stages, you actually flourish. You become like the blossom. I mean, a flower just doesn't blossom. First of all, the bud begins to appear. Then it gets bigger, and then it gets bigger. And finally, in the final fanfare, it blossoms, it flourishes. And that's what I call flourishing. Not everybody in the academic world agrees with me on that, but anyhow, that's my position.
Yes, and that's connected with this next question. You quote, to quote your book, your energy field is unstable when you feel uneasy, impatient, frustrated, annoyed, anxious, jealous, stressed, depressed, etc. All of the feelings associated with emotional distress are indicators of ego-soul misalignment. But what is the most efficient way to correct this?
Well, again, it depends on the severity of the misalignment. So let's not talk about schizophrenia or these very serious conditions. But let's talk about the normal person who gets upset and angry and frustrated and sometimes a bit unhappy and impatient.
So how can you do it? I'm sure you've heard of the Course in Miracles.
Yes, I have.
There's a statement that I'll never forget from the Course that says, there is no justification for anger.
Right. Okay, so let me explain how can you tell? In another book of mine called What My Soul Told Me, A Practical Guide to Soul Activation, I have these 4 stages of connecting with the soul, befriending the soul, trusting the soul, and becoming one with the soul. And in each of these stages, I have practical things that you can do. So I'm going to give you just one of those right now. So every time that I get upset, which is less and less, my wife will vouch for that. I'm hardly ever angry and very rarely upset and just take everything in my stride. I got to that place by using the mantra on myself, I have no needs. Because all my needs are met by my soul before I even know I have them. And so whenever I get a little bit impatient or upset, I remind myself, I have no needs. Because the reason I got upset or impatient was because I thought I had a need and it wasn't met. Okay, and so that means I'm not trusting my soul to provide. I'm not being true to who I really am. Because when you're living in soul consciousness, honestly, everything that you need shows up, and you're in the flow, and you have no needs. And my wife says to me sometimes, well, How can you say you have no needs when I do this and I do that? I says, there you are. You just proved my point.
Beautiful. Yes. You mentioned our unique self.
Yeah.
Is this synonymous with personality?
It not necessarily. I think there's more to personality. I think this concept of unique self, which was originated, well, actually, it's been around for a long time, is a way of saying, look, when you're operating out of ego consciousness, you are operating unconsciously. You're not really thinking about, you're just reacting, and that's a false self. That's not who we really are. Then comes, well, okay, I individuate and begin to recognize that I'm not my conditioning, and therefore I find my true self. And at the level of the true self, we're all individuated aspects of that universal energy field. But you have different gifts than I do, and I have different gifts than you do. And so when you operate at the true self, we're operating at the level of the culture of consciousness, of soul consciousness. But the unique self is a way of saying, well, okay, so you are a soul having human experience, and you have a collective consciousness with all other souls, but you have specific gifts and talents.
Right.
And that's the way in which I use the unique self, to say, well, okay, so we're all in a sense the same, but in another sense, we're all a little bit different.
Right. Okay, so you wrote, further progress in the evolution of human consciousness requires us to stop filtering our awareness and start expanding our awareness. That's probably a synopsis of what the whole book is about. How would we stop filtering our awareness and start expanding our awareness? How do we do that?
Well, so there are, it's not a one-stop destination. It's not like I'm going to take the bus to get there. Okay, it's a lifetime journey. Okay, and so each stage of psychological development takes us along that journey. So we can now, as you mentioned right at the very beginning, if we are brought up by self-actualized parents who don't try to program us or condition us, but allow us to express who we are, that journey gets a hell of a lot more easy. Yes. Because we don't come into the individuating stage with this conditioning and this and so now we can move more quickly into soul consciousness, because up to the age of 24, well, the first half of our life is about growing the ego in the sense of being able to manage our survival, safety, and security. And there's nothing wrong with the ego doing that. But when the ego gets into fear, that's when all of the problems begin to occur. That's where the emotional instability comes from. And that's when we get out of alignment with our soul. Right. The second half of our life is about actualizing the soul. Practically, the majority of the population on the planet really hasn't got to the individuating stage. It's up to recent times, it was the privilege of the elites, because the non-elites were struggling to survive and really had no time at all to think about individuating. And so for most of the people on the planet, they live unconsciously in these first three stages of development. So if you manage to get past that, then you're in a minority, but a growing minority, if you see what I mean. There are more and more people moving into individuating and self-actualizing because our parents have experienced, in the Western world, have experienced levels of prosperity over the past 50 or 60 years, which has taken away the survival difficulty. And so they've been able to individuate and self-actualize, and now they're bringing up children, we call them millennials, who have never had to worry about these things. So they've got a head start.
So we have millions of people in the world still at the level of survival consciousness, where they're striving for clean water and to have health care and have food and shelter. So that's all the needs of the ego. So once they've acquired that,
let me just say that you call it the needs of the ego. It's actually the needs. It's the needs of the body, and the ego takes care of those needs.
Right. Exactly. So there's really no hope for those people to consider levels of consciousness until they get those needs met.
Well, Yes.
We don't have time for
Yes,
anything else.
and I'm going to um, it is possible to move to accelerate that process, because I'll give you an example. Somebody on our team has been working with an Aboriginal population in Australia. Now, you know, the Aboriginals really are really connected to Earth, but they've been confined to communities, and they've lost their way of life, and there's a lot of drunkenness, and there's a lot of, and because they've just simply lost their way of life. So we've been working with an Aboriginal community in North Queensland, and we've turned that whole situation around, and simply by explaining that they have choices, and that yes, they have difficulty with the survival needs. Their relationships, because of that, their relationships are not what they could be, and their self-esteem is very low. But they have a choice, and by explaining the model, we have actually in one community in Northern Queensland completely turned that around. This community is now thriving. And so it doesn't mean that, you know, that you're condemned. It absolutely doesn't, but it does require how shall I put it, an intervention where people are shown this model of reality and saying, well, this is where you are now operating, and we can measure it through the tools that I developed, and the choice is yours. You can make changes, and it's amazing. It's amazing, absolutely amazing, the changes that have been made in that. And it's now looked upon by the government of Australia as an example, at least of Queensland, of what can be achieved in a hopeless situation.
Beautiful. So you wrote, connecting involves leading a values-driven life, adopting the values that are shared by everyone at the soul level. What are those values?
Well, these are the values, the soul values. I call them universal values because we actually have them all in the depth of our being. But if you're living unconsciously out of the first in your programming and conditioning, you're not so aware of these soul values. But once you get to the individuating stage, you are aware of the soul values, you are aware of the universal values. So what do those values look like? They can be split into three types of values. One set of values are about self-expression. So creativity would be, for example, a soul value. It's very creativity. It comes from inspiration, another soul value. Honesty. Why honesty? Because honesty creates connectedness. So there's self-expression, and then there's connectedness, and then there's contribution. These are the three reasons why the soul incarnates: to self-express, connect, and contribute. So any values that relate to self-expression, to connecting with others, and in an unconditional loving relationship, and making a contribution to the good of the whole, any values that are there are actually what I would call universal values, soul values, and you find them everywhere amongst self-actualization.
Excellent. Another quote, unexpressed emotions are the cause of all our mental and physical disorders. How can this be true for contagious diseases like AIDS or bacterial and viral diseases people in some countries contract from bad water and food?
So this is a very good question, because this question, directly impacts this whole idea of duality. So, so we either have to say we live in a material world or we live in an energetic world. So if we consider these diseases as spread by viruses, okay, in our material world, we call them viruses. We actually live in an energetic world. And so these viruses have an energetic, are also energies, okay? They are energies that come into contact with our own energy. And we give these energies more force and power to the extent that we believe they are material and real. Now, I'm not saying that, I'm not going as far as to say you can cure disease, which contagious diseases, through your belief system, but I am saying that you must recognize that your attitude to it can actually change the outcome. And this is not exactly parallel, I will admit, but this whole idea of the the word escapes me at the moment.
Okay.
Placebo. The whole idea of the placebo effect is very interesting, and it actually I had given an example in the book which goes beyond taking a pill, which you believe will cure you, and it does cure you. And this was an example of people who are going through knee surgery. They all had, found a group of people with all the same knee problem. They split them into 3 groups. They did one surgical intervention with one group to correct it. They did a different surgical intervention with another group. And the third group, they prepared them for the surgical intervention. They went into theater, they cut the knee, they sewed it up, and they didn't do anything. And everybody's knee got better. All right. Okay, that is powerful.
Yes.
That is powerful. Now, I can't fully answer your question, but there's a doorway there, there's an opening there to answer this particular question, I believe. So how do we relate viruses and things to the energetic world? Somewhere there is an understanding that we yet don't have. And because, as we talked about earlier, everything is energetic. We live inside that energetic, and viruses are, if we give them a material aspect,
yes,
then, but actually they are energetic in some way. So we have to figure that out. I haven't got the answer to that question, but it's a great question, and I'd love to be able to sort it out.
It almost seems like a person that lives a life with less stress and less emotional challenges is going to be less susceptible to the viruses and the bacteria.
I would totally agree with that. Because emotion, for me, I define emotion as need met or not met, or might not be met. And if you have a need, the ego has a need, and the need is met, you feel happy. If the need is not met, you feel angry. And if the need might not be met, then you feel anxious. Right. If the body has needs and is not met, we jump into fear. If the soul has a desire, then and it's not met, the soul feels sad, which leads to depression. If the soul has a desire which is met, which leads to joy. So for me, these are the 6 emotions, and it's all based on whether our needs or desires are met or are not met.
Right. This next quote actually partly answers that question. It says the functioning of the body-mind is most easily impaired when the reptilian mind-brain's neurological functions are developing. Consequently, energetic instability during this period can impair the functioning of the body-mind for the rest of our lives. You mentioned that earlier.
Right.
Is there any way to overcome this?
Yep, as I mentioned earlier, it depends how serious the impact is. But what happens is that it either closes down or opens up one of the 7 chakras. And I mentioned earlier Arthur Janoff and the Primal Screamer, and there are other people who do that work, which is that regression work through hypnotherapy to relive the experiences of being in the womb or being a baby, and to give new meaning to that. Because these energetic disturbances are all about all created by fear or our inability to give meaning to a situation. A trauma, for example, is a experience, life or death experience, where we were unable to fit it into our meaning making, and so we suppress. And when we can't fit something into our meaning making, we assume the worst fear possible, and we suppress that into our subconscious in order to go on living. But it won't stay suppressed. It will keep bubbling up, and that's what post-traumatic stress disorder is all about. It's about the bubbling up of this suppressed experience which we couldn't give meaning to, and which defaulted to the worst possible fear that we have.
Right.
And so it does require deep intervention and to give it a new meaning if we're going to get past that. But it can be done.
Thank you. You wrote, a life filled with acceptance is a life devoid of unnecessary emotional suffering. It's a life filled with love. Does this mean we should just accept all injustices?
Absolutely not. What I mean by acceptance in this is whatever is happening is what is. So we give it all the meaning it has for us, okay? So it's like, this just happened to you, the same thing happened to me, you give it one meaning, I give it another meaning, and that based on our programming and our conditioning. And so acceptance for me is simply saying, okay, this happened, I don't have to give it a meaning, these are the events and this is what happened. I'm not using the word acceptance in the terms of of something that which is lacking in love. Let me give you an example which happened to me recently. I experienced someone who was clearly to me trying to manipulate me by getting power over me, okay? And it went on, and in the end I said, look, I'm sorry, I can't go on with this. I love you because you're an individuated aspect of the universal energy field, but I simply don't want you in my life.
All right. Good.
You know, I don't want that energy around me, but it doesn't stop me loving you. I just don't want you around.
Excellent. Where do our emotions come from?
Well, so our emotions are basically the energetic, is basically energetic instability, where a need, as I said earlier, is either met, not met, or may not be met. And so if we think we have a need, then we will definitely have emotions. And and so the trick in life, I mean, I say this tongue in cheek, but it's true, is to become emotionless or have less emotion in your life, because emotion is simply this idea that life is not perfect and therefore I have got needs. And if I've got needs, then I open the door to fear. As soon as I open the door to fear, I've let love out of the door, and I'm now living in a dependent world. And I don't want to do that. And so as you learn to, as you focus on the fact that, you know, if you can believe that by surrendering to your soul, all your needs will be met. And that's what many scriptures talk about, surrendering. If you could surrender to that, which means trusting your soul, then you will have less needs and you will have less emotions, and you will feel a deeper sense of contentment, which will, which will peak in moments of joy as you recognize your true essence.
So it reminds me of, there was some place you wrote that emotions are connected with the soul. So Vulcans, like Spock from Star Trek, would you say they have no soul because they have no emotions?
Well, I've never encountered an extraterrestrial being, and so I can't really comment on that. So I believe everybody that is in this three-dimensional material world, and it's not actually a material, it's a property of our senses, has a soul, because to be in this world, you had to drop down from the fourth dimension of energetic awareness into the three-dimensional energetic awareness. And so you know, if that's what our three-dimensional material world is about, there can't be anybody in this world who doesn't have a soul. Otherwise, because you couldn't get here in any if you didn't have a soul. Because when you die, you don't lose consciousness; you just lose the awareness of three-dimensional material reality. And so, in that sense, I don't think there's anybody on this planet who doesn't have a soul. But have you asked me another question, which is, do many people ignore their soul? And absolutely, they get so the ego gets created, and the ego gets so enraptured with this three-dimensional material world that it loses all connection to the soul, because it only sees separation.
Right. Now, you talk a lot in your book about the difference between 4D reality and 3D reality. For our listeners who haven't read the book yet, could you describe that difference?
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to ask the viewers, not the viewers or the listeners, to do a little experiment. I'm going to ask them to hold their hand palm down with fingers down, and to drop those fingers onto a flat surface so the 5 fingers touch that surface, and to say in their mind, okay, on this flat surface of a two-dimensional world, there are two-dimensional beings. They can see length and breadth, but they have no idea about height. And so when these fingers appear in their world, they see 5 separate circles, because that's what all they can see. And so this person who's out for a walk in their two-dimensional world with a two-dimensional dog sees these 5 separate circles and says, wow, that's interesting. That wasn't here yesterday. And calls her friend, the two-dimensional scientist, who comes and tries to move one of these circles, and it moves, and then all the other circles move. And then you try to move another circle, and it moves, and then all the other circles move. And so she draws up a set of equations to explain these 5 separate circles. Well, you and I know these aren't 5 separate circles. They're actually connected at a higher dimension of reality. Right. So that's exactly the way we are from the 3rd to the 4th. We don't understand all of the connectedness. So if you take a comb and cover up the top half of a comb, all you see are separate teeth. That's you, that's me, that's everybody else on the planet. When you lift your hand, you see the connecting bar at the top. That's exactly how we are. That's the 4th dimension of energetic. The 4th dimension is that connected world, but we only see, because our perception is limited to so few frequencies, we only see a small part of the world. We don't see the soul connecting us. So when you bump into your best friend who you haven't seen in 20 years, you think it's by chance. Actually, it's not. It's souls working with souls and creating. I mean, just the other day, I bumped into someone, and, you know, there was a series of circumstances meant I was late for this, and I missed that, and then I got on the right bus, and I got off, and there was this person and then we had a lovely conversation. Now, how the heck did all that happen?
Right. Talk about divine plan, huh?
Yeah, it's like, wow, that happened at that 4th dimension. It was arranged by the soul. And that's why I say the soul, that's why I say I have no needs, because the soul can pull all of these strings and have all my needs be met before I even know I have them.
Okay, you talk about a certain development in consciousness where we come to the point where service is our main raison d'etre, our reason for being. So what would you say to a person who is a quadriplegic, totally dependent on other people to take care of them? Then they have no reason for being other than to be needful.
Well, you see, many ways of being
of service.
You're thinking of service in physical terms, of doing something for somebody. These people, some of them are of service to other people through example, through role modeling, through. I mean, I've seen this picture of, I believe it's a guy with no hands and no legs, and he plays football. Right? You know, he jokes about, I'm a really good goalie, you know. And he sets an example to people not to give up. So don't define purpose and don't define service purely in instrumental terms. There are people in service who, through example and by not giving in and keeping going and showing us the zest for life when most of us would have given up.
Yes.
That is service to me.
Okay. You talk a lot about the soul and the ego. So there's a lot of people who are saying there's an increase in the population all of the time. More souls are coming into the world. So where does the soul come from?
Hey, boy, if I could answer that question, that would be lovely. Yeah, I get to ask that question. Hey, there is so much we don't know. You know, and again, what's happening there is you're reasoning in physical terms. You're not reasoning in energetic terms. And to reason in energetic terms, we'd have to move into a whole new country where there would be so many things that we did not understand. So there is nothing to say that there is a one-to-one relationship between the number of souls in the world and the number of people on the planet. You know, there could be
A group soul?
many more souls out in the fourth dimensional world who have never even thought about incarnating. We don't know.
Right.
We honestly don't know. We do know that there are some that incarnate into our three-dimensional material world. Now, there may be other dimensions out there where some souls incarnate into those dimensions, and they may be very different dimensions that we can't fully comprehend. So there's no way of answering your question because it comes from three-dimensional materiality, and it comes.
That's true. Our limited. We can only imagine. In our imagination, we can create anything.
Yeah, we can only using our powers of reason within the experience that we're having.
Right.
You know, we have to move beyond that and embrace the unknown. And say that I can't answer that question.
Getting back to something more concrete that you talked about, what are the 7 stages of psychological development?
Okay, so this is the fundamental basis of my work. It builds from the 7 levels of consciousness. Most of psychology, most of the scientific and academic world in the psychological domain operates in what I call flatland. They don't recognize the verticality of consciousness. So if they thought about it, they would, because it's pretty obvious that the baby who is born is operating at a different level of consciousness, and there's different needs, and there's a different stage of development than the infant. And the infant is at a different stage than the teenager, and the teenager is at a different stage than the 24-year-old. So the stages of development relates to the season of our lives and relate to the needs that are necessary during the season of that life. So first of all, it starts off with survival, which is when the reptilian mind brain is dominant up to the age of 2. And all the baby is concerned with, frankly, is surviving and getting its physiological needs met. As soon as it begins to learn that there are other people in the world, the ego begins to form, the limbic mind brain becomes dominant, and it's now having hopefully managed to control the parents by crying and doing things and getting its needs met. Now it's looking for safety. And that's the second stage of development. And then I call that conforming. And we need to conform in order to feel safe. And then comes the differentiating stage, where now I'm beginning to leave the home. I'm 7 or 8 years old. My neocortex is coming in. And I'm moving out of the home into the school and in the larger world. And I realize that whilst I was pretty much loved in the home, now I'm in a bigger world, and I need, in order to feel as like I belong, I need respect and I need recognition. And I try to find a group that I can align with that give me some form of recognition. That's how gangs form and kids form groups at school. And some people get left aside, and but it's all about recognition. And then we move to the point in our 20s when we either individuate or not, depending on what type of situation we're living in and how well we manage these first 3 sets of needs. And individuating is about having the freedom and the autonomy to be who you really are outside of your parental and cultural controls. And as we find that freedom and autonomy, begin to find out who we are, as we dig deeper in our 40s, we realize that there is we are passionate about something. We may have had this career up to now, but gosh, what I'm passionate about is that was my case. I was a transportation engineer up to my 40s, and then I realized I was bored with that. What I realized was that I was a transformation engineer, and when I was 17, I'd completely misheard my soul. I thought he said transportation, actually he said transformation. And so in my 40s, I changed my whole life. I had a fantastic top of my career. I changed my whole life to do what I do now. And then in my 50s, I found my meaning and purpose, and I had found my gift. And so in order to give that gift and make a difference, I had to make a difference. But to make a difference, I had to connect. So 50 is all about connecting so you can make a difference. And once you've been in that mode, you get to the point where there's nothing else to do. You just want to be of service to humanity and the planet. And this is when you get to our age, our 60s or 70s, we want to be of service to humanity. And if we've managed a successful life up to this point, we're quite willing to give this away, because we've come to the point that we recognize when we give to each other, we're giving to ourselves. When I give to you, I give to myself, because they're another individuated aspect of the universal energy field, and there's nothing else to do but to contribute. And if you can successfully move through those 7 stages, you will be healthy and you will live a long life.
Right. So it sounds like that's pretty much a definition of human well-being, which is what your book's all about.
Okay, so this is again where I differ a little bit from the academic world. I define well-being as being able to master the needs of the stage of the development that you're at. So you can have a sense of self-being as a baby, you can have a sense of well-being as an infant, etc. Now, they also talk about flourishing, and they talk about flourishing again as a flatland concept. I don't call it flourishing. I reserve this word for the latter 2 stages of our lives, when we've managed to overcome all our fears and we've met all of those needs of the first 5 stages of development. We've self-actualized, we're beginning to connect, to make a difference, and that's when we come into full bloom, and that's flourishing. So my workshop, for example, that I'm doing in Tuscany in 2 weeks' time is called From Wellbeing to Flourishing. How do you get from well-being to flourishing?
Beautiful. And a final question is, if you can explain your reasons for writing the book.
Yeah, in fact, I think I did that at the very beginning, but let me just dig that a bit deeper. I wrote the book in order to bring the soul back into psychology. That was the basic reason I wrote that book, because I realized that psychology has become an academic cognitive science and ignores the soul. For the academic world, the soul is an absolute no-no. You can't go there. So let me just illustrate that point with a very simple, with something that happened to me 2 years ago. I was speaking at a prestigious business university in Europe. It was called really at-edge title. It was called something like Spirituality and Creativity in Business Life, or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And I had the opening keynote, which was a great honor. And I had the audience do something I'd never done before, but I've done ever since. I took them through this exercise. I said, I want you to stand up if this statement is true for you. And I said, I have a television. People stood up. I said, I am a television. Nobody stood up. I said, I have a car. Nearly everybody stood up. I said, I am a car. Nobody stood up. I said, I have an ego. Most people stood up. I said, I am an ego. Some people stood up. I said, I have a soul. Everybody stood up. 200 or 300 people stood up. I said, I am a soul. They all stayed standing. Well, wow. First thing that was, it said to me is that, first of all, they're a little confused whether they have a soul or they are a soul, and that's huge difference. Yes. But what came next was really interesting, because the next speakers were neuroscientists from quite well-known people from America, and they had a set of slides, and clearly they haven't had an opportunity to change their slides, because the first slide said assumptions we make, and the first slide said there is no soul. And the whole audience had been standing up. I mean, that's the problem with the academic world. They don't get it.
Yes, very good.
And everybody in the audience got it.
Yeah. There's a limitation in how we perceive. All is perception.
Yeah.
Excellent. Richard, thank you so much for your time. It's
You're welcome.
Around almost 4 o'clock in the UK in the afternoon.
Yeah, only I'm in Italy.
Oh, you're in Italy now. Okay. Totally different time.
Yeah, but it's an hour further. I'm nearly at 5 o'clock.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful.
Thanks for being on time, and thanks for a lovely discussion, and it was a joy to meet you. Where are you located?
Marina del Rey, California, between Santa Monica and LA Airport.
Oh, yeah. I lived in America for 20-some years, so I'm very familiar with it. Actually, I'm an American citizen, to tell you the truth.
Wonderful. Pleasure meeting you and talking to you.
Bye.